Alexander Russo straightened his tie in the mirror, studying the lines around his eyes, each one earned through years of calculation and patience. At 45, he had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small security consulting firm into one of the most respected private intelligence companies in the country. People whispered that Alexander never forgot a slight, never forgave a betrayal, and never lost a game he decided to play. But they said it quietly, because crossing Alexander Russo was widely understood to be a catastrophic mistake. His sprawling Connecticut estate reflected the success that had come from this reputation. 6 bedrooms, a private study filled with first-edition books and chess sets from around the world, and grounds meticulously maintained year-round. Today, those grounds were covered in a fresh blanket of Christmas snow. "Daddy!" 8-year-old Sophie bounded into his bedroom, her holiday dress swirling around her. "Grandma's here, and she brought me a special present already. She said I don't have to wait." Alexander's jaw tightened imperceptibly at the mention of his mother-in-law, Vivian Montgomery. For 15 years, Vivian had made it clear that Alexander would never be good enough for her daughter Brooke, despite, or perhaps because of, his meteoric rise from the son of a Boston dock worker to where he was now. Did she now? Alexander picked up Sophie, kissing her forehead. "And what did Mother Montgomery bestow upon her favorite grandchild this year?" "It's a special locket with pictures of me, Grandma, Mom, and Leo inside." Sophie's eyes brightened. "But not you, Daddy. Grandma said there wasn't enough room." "I'm sure she did," Alexander murmured, setting Sophie down. "Why don't you go help your brother with the table? The guests will be arriving soon." As Sophie ran off, Alexander took a moment to collect himself. Brooke had been distant for months now, canceling their date nights, taking mysterious weekend trips to conferences, and spending hours on encrypted calls that ended abruptly when he entered a room. Leo, their 13-year-old son, had begun avoiding him entirely, suddenly uninterested in their weekend chess matches that had once been sacred ritual. Alexander hadn't built his company, Sentinel Intelligence, by being oblivious to patterns. Someone was turning his family against him, and he had his suspicions about who was leading the charge. He just needed confirmation, and patience had always been his greatest weapon. Downstairs, the house was transformed for their annual Christmas gathering. The 20-foot tree sparkled with ornaments collected from their travels. Caterers moved efficiently through the kitchen, and the first guests were arriving. Colleagues, friends, and family who had become part of their tradition over the years. "There's my favorite security genius." Maxwell Price, Alexander's oldest friend and the chief technical officer at Sentinel, clapped him on the shoulder. Max had been with Alexander since they'd shared a dorm room at MIT. The scholarship kid from Southie and the brilliant hacker from Oakland finding common ground in their outsider status. "Max, glad you could make it." Alexander guided him toward the private study. "Scotch." Once the door closed behind them, Max's cheerful expression faded. "I got what you asked for, Alex. You're not going to like it." Alexander accepted the flash drive Max handed him, his face impassive. "When have I ever shot the messenger, old friend?" "There's something else." Max hesitated. "Vivian closed 3 accounts last week. She's moved nearly $2 million into offshore holdings." Alexander tucked the drive into his pocket. "Interesting timing. And Prescott Caldwell's name is all over the communications," Max added. "Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon." Prescott Caldwell. The name sent a cold ripple down Alexander's spine. Prescott had been his primary competitor for years, the CEO of Blackline Security, and, apparently, his wife's lover for the past 8 months, if Max's surveillance was correct. "It seems our Christmas dinner may be more eventful than anticipated," Alexander said quietly, pouring 2 glasses of his finest scotch. "To chess, Max. The game is always won by the player who sees 3 moves ahead." They clinked glasses as the sounds of the party swelled outside the study door. By 7 o'clock, 24 guests were seated at the magnificent dining table adorned with crystal and silver. Alexander sat at the head, observing the subtle dynamics playing out before him. Brooke, resplendent in a designer red dress, was seated at the opposite end, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Vivian was positioned strategically beside Leo, whispering occasionally in his ear. The meal progressed through 5 expertly prepared courses. Wine flowed freely, conversations hummed, and holiday cheer seemed to permeate the room, except for the invisible current of tension running between Alexander and his immediate family. As dessert was being served, Brooke tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The gentle chime silenced the table. "I have an announcement to make," she said, her voice carrying an undercurrent of defiance. "As some of you know, I've been considering a significant change in my life." Alexander set down his fork, his face a careful mask of neutral interest. "I've accepted a position with an international educational foundation," Brooke continued. "And I'm taking the children with me to Europe. Without you, Alexander." Her gaze fixed on him coldly. "They don't want you in their lives anymore." A hush fell over the table. Leo stared down at his plate, refusing to meet Alexander's eyes. Sophie looked confused, glancing between her parents. Vivian's lips curved into a satisfied smirk. Alexander absorbed the blow without flinching, noting the subtle ways his guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He took a deliberate sip of water, set down his glass, and straightened his cuffs. "I see," he said, his voice steady. "And when is this grand departure scheduled to occur?" "We leave the day after tomorrow," Brooke replied. "The children's things are already packed." Alexander nodded once. "Before you go, there's a delivery for everyone." He pressed a button on his phone, and the house's massive front doors opened. In fact, it appears to have just arrived. 5 years earlier, Alexander had first noticed the shift in his marriage. It wasn't anything dramatic, just subtle changes in Brooke's behavior. Late nights at her charity foundation, new friends he'd never met, a growing interest in privacy that seemed out of character for the woman who had once shared everything with him. Alexander had built his career on understanding that information was power, but he'd resisted the urge to turn his professional skills on his family. That changed the night he discovered Brooke had created a separate bank account with $1 million transferred from their joint funds. Money she claimed was for a special project at her foundation, but had actually been wired to an account in Geneva. Concerned but methodical, Alexander had begun gathering information, building a complete picture over months rather than confronting Brooke with fragments. He discovered the foundation was real but functioning as a shell for something else, a sophisticated operation designed to quietly extract wealth from high-net-worth individuals through a combination of relationship manipulation and falsified investment opportunities. The mastermind wasn't Brooke, she was merely an accomplished player. It was Prescott Caldwell, whose security firm competed with Alexander's, but also operated a lucrative side business targeting wealthy men through their wives and families. The pattern was elegant. Identify a successful man whose work kept him too busy to notice subtle changes at home. Insert an operative, sometimes a lover, sometimes a friend, to influence the wife. Turn the children slowly against their father. Isolate him emotionally while systematically draining his accounts through investments and charitable contributions. When the extraction was complete, the family would disappear, usually to Europe, where they would be rewarded with a small percentage of the take before being abandoned. Alexander had uncovered 7 previous victims, each following the same pattern. Formerly successful men now divorced, financially ruined, and estranged from their children. What made Prescott's scheme nearly undetectable was that his victims were too embarrassed to admit how completely they'd been played, both emotionally and financially. When Alexander realized he was Prescott's next target, and that Brooke was not just complicit but enthusiastic, he made a decision. He would not confront them immediately. Instead, he would play along, appearing oblivious while meticulously preparing his counter-strategy. For 3 years, Alexander had lived a double life. To Brooke and the children, he was the increasingly distant husband and father, too absorbed in work to notice their growing disdain. To Prescott's network, he was the perfect mark, wealthy, proud, and blind to his wife's betrayal. Behind this facade, Alexander worked tirelessly with a small circle of trusted allies. Max handled the technical surveillance. Daria Nowak, his head of security and former Special Forces operative, coordinated a team tracking Prescott's global operation. And Roland Pierce, an attorney who specialized in both family law and criminal prosecution, built legal cases so airtight they could withstand any challenge. As Alexander permitted Brooke and Vivian to gradually turn Leo against him, he ensured that Sophie, too young to be fully manipulated, maintained her natural affection for her father through secret chess lessons and bedtime stories when the others thought he was working late. During these years, Alexander allowed Brooke to siphon nearly $30 million from various accounts into the web of shells and fronts controlled by Prescott. Every transfer was documented, every conversation recorded, every meeting photographed. He created an elaborate financial honeypot, making it appear that his most valuable assets were accessible through specific accounts, when in fact his true wealth had been secured in structures so complex that even the most sophisticated financial investigators would be unable to trace them. The most difficult part had been watching his son's growing coldness. Leo had once idolized Alexander, following him around the house, begging to learn chess, proudly telling friends about his father's work. Now, at 13, Leo barely acknowledged Alexander's presence, his young mind poisoned by years of careful manipulation from his mother, grandmother, and the tutors hired by Prescott's organization. 2 months before Christmas, Alexander had received confirmation that Brooke was planning the final extraction. $30 million wasn't enough. Prescott wanted everything, including ownership of Sentinel Intelligence itself. Alexander had allowed Brooke to believe she had access to the company's controlling shares through falsified documents Max had created specifically for this purpose. "You're letting them take too much," Daria had warned during a secure meeting at an off-books location. "They'll strip everything before they run." "That's precisely what I'm counting on," Alexander had replied. "The bigger the theft, the stronger the case, and the more complete their downfall." Prescott's mistake had been targeting Alexander Russo. While his previous victims had been wealthy, none possessed Alexander's particular combination of skills, resources, and ruthless patience. They hadn't built global intelligence networks or specialized in unraveling complex schemes. And none of them lived by Alexander's personal code. Betrayal was unforgivable, and revenge was a dish served not just cold, but with meticulous attention to detail. As Christmas approached, Alexander detected all the signs that the endgame was imminent. Brooke's secret meetings increased. Large sums moved through the honeypot accounts. The children's passports mysteriously disappeared from the safe, where Alexander had placed traceable decoys months earlier. And Vivian began liquidating her assets, preparing for her role in the escape. Everything pointed to a post-Christmas departure. Alexander prepared accordingly, ensuring every element of his counter-strategy was in place. What he hadn't anticipated was Brooke's Christmas dinner announcement, a tactical error on her part, driven by arrogance and a desire to humiliate him publicly. As his lawyer Roland Pierce walked into the dining room carrying a stack of small, gift-wrapped boxes, Alexander allowed himself the faintest smile. Brooke had just accelerated his timeline, not realizing she'd walked directly into his trap. The dining room fell silent as Roland Pierce, impeccable in a tailored suit, entered carrying a tray of small, elegantly wrapped packages. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said, rising from his chair. "Since my family has decided to share their plans for the future, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to distribute some special gifts I've prepared." Roland moved around the table, placing a small box beside each person's dessert plate. When he reached Brooke, Vivian, and Leo, he placed slightly larger packages before them. "Please." Alexander gestured to the room. Everyone opened them together. The guests, clearly uncomfortable but curious, began unwrapping their packages. Inside each was a small, exquisitely crafted crystal chess piece, a different piece for each guest, personalized with a tiny engraving of their name. "As many of you know, chess has always been my passion," Alexander explained. "Each of you has played a role in my life, represented by the piece you now hold." The guests murmured appreciatively, examining their personalized gifts, rooks for steadfast friends, knights for those who had shown particular loyalty, bishops for advisors. Max found himself holding a crystal queen, the most powerful piece on the board. Alexander turned his attention to his family. "Brooke, Mother Montgomery, Leo, your gifts are special editions. Please, open them." With trembling fingers, Brooke unwrapped her package, revealing not a chess piece but a small digital screen. When she touched it, it illuminated with video footage, Brooke and Prescott in intimate situations, followed by recordings of them discussing the details of their scheme, explicit mentions of the fraudulent foundation, and their plans to leave Alexander financially ruined. Vivian's package contained a similar device, showing her role in the conspiracy, meetings with offshore bankers, coaching Leo to reject his father, and detailed discussions about her cut of Alexander's wealth. Leo's package was different, a simple leather journal. When he opened it, he found years of entries in his father's handwriting. Each one documented a moment when Alexander had been present in his son's life, even when Leo hadn't realized it. Sitting in his car outside soccer games Leo had told him not to attend, detailed notes about his accomplishments and interests, and painful reflections on watching his son turn against him through no fault of his own. "What is this?" Brooke whispered, her face ashen. "Chess is about seeing the entire board," Alexander replied calmly. "For 3 years, you, Prescott, and your mother have been playing a game you thought I didn't know existed. You've moved your pieces precisely according to plan, isolating me, turning my children against me, preparing to take everything I've built." Alexander walked to the center of the room. "What you didn't realize is that I've been playing a different game entirely. While you were focused on the obvious moves, I was positioning my pieces for this exact moment." He pressed a button on his phone, and the dining room's large television screen came to life, showing live video feeds. FBI agents entering Prescott Caldwell's home and offices, international police raiding the Geneva accounts, and Prescott himself being escorted in handcuffs from what appeared to be a private airfield. 37 victims in 9 countries, Alexander continued. All with the same pattern. Wealthy men targeted through their wives and families, their assets systematically drained. But you made a critical error when you selected me as your next target. Brooke's digital screen now showed documentation of every fraudulent transfer she had initiated, every falsified investment, every forged signature. "The 30 million you believe you've stolen? It never left my control. Every account, every shell company, every foundation has been monitored and documented by international financial crimes units for the past 2 years." The room was absolutely silent now. Some guests watched in shock. Others, the knights and queens Alexander had trusted, showed no surprise at all. "Mother Montgomery." Alexander turned to Vivian, whose face had gone from shock to calculating. "The 2 million you moved offshore last week triggered freezes on all associated accounts. Your involvement has been documented in detail." Vivian stood suddenly. "This is preposterous. You can't prove." "I believe your own voice on those recordings is proof enough," Alexander interrupted. "The international banking violations alone carry a minimum 15-year sentence." Brooke collapsed in her chair, the screen slipping from her fingers. "The children," she gasped. "You can't. The children are not part of your deal with Prescott," Alexander said, his voice hardening for the first time. "Did you really think I wouldn't protect them? Sophie was too young for your manipulation, and Leo," he looked at his son, whose eyes were fixed on the journal, tears streaming down his face. "Leo deserves to know the truth about what his mother and grandmother have done." Roland Pierce stepped forward again. "Mrs. Russo, Mrs. Montgomery, you are both named in federal indictments that were unsealed 20 minutes ago. Agents are waiting outside. I suggest you cooperate fully." As if on cue, the front door opened, and federal agents entered the dining room. Vivian was the first to be handcuffed, still protesting loudly. Brooke seemed to have gone into shock, offering no resistance as she was led away. The guests began excusing themselves hurriedly, leaving only those who had known about Alexander's counter-strategy, the knights, bishops, and queens of his real-life chess game. Leo remained seated, clutching the journal, his young face contorted with confusion and pain. "Dad," he asked, his voice small. "Did Mom really? Was it all?" Alexander knelt beside his son. "Not everything was a lie, Leo. She loves you in her way. But she made terrible choices, and now she has to face the consequences." "What happens to us?" Leo whispered. "We rebuild," Alexander said simply. "Sophie and you with me. One day at a time." From the doorway, Sophie watched wide-eyed as federal agents escorted her mother and grandmother to waiting vehicles. Alexander crossed to her, lifting her into his arms. "Is Mommy in trouble?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart. Very serious trouble." "Are you sad?" Alexander considered the question carefully. "I'm sad about what we've lost, but not about what happens to people who betray the ones they're supposed to love." Later that night, after the house had emptied and the children were asleep, Alexander sat in his study with Max, Daria, and Roland. The chess set on his desk was arranged in the final position of a decisive victory. To the end of Prescott Caldwell's operation, Max raised his glass. And to the seven-figure bonuses you're all receiving, Alexander added, along with my eternal gratitude. What about the children? Daria asked. This won't be easy for them. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Alexander replied. But they'll have the truth, therapy, and a father who never stopped fighting for them. Roland examined the chessboard. You sacrificed the queen to secure this victory. That's unusual for you. Alexander's expression hardened. Some pieces aren't worth saving once they've been compromised. He reset the board, carefully positioning each piece in its starting position. And some betrayals can never be forgiven, only avenged. As his team departed, Alexander stood at his window, watching the last federal vehicle pull away with Brooke inside. In his pocket was her wedding ring, which she'd thrown at him while being led away. He turned it over once in his fingers, then dropped it into a small wooden box where he kept other mementos of battles won and enemies defeated. Tomorrow would bring press coverage, legal proceedings, and the beginning of a new chapter with his children. But tonight, Alexander Russo allowed himself a moment of cold satisfaction. The game was over. Checkmate.